From No5 Chambers, I'm Richard Kimblin, and this is the Planning Podcast. We turn now to a feature of the Planning White Paper and a feature of all residential planning, which is very, very prominent in practice. Housing land supply, finding out what the requirement is, and the method which goes into that. There is a premise within the White Paper, and generally, that when one increases the supply, with it comes improving affordability. Here we look at whether that's correct, and if so, to what extent, and whether it is a bit more nuanced, and whether other features come with that increase in supply. We also look at whether that's the right question to be asking, and we're very much assisted in that regard by the terrific work by Nikodem Szumilo at the Bartlett School at UCL. He's been looking at this for years. His academic work is terrific. We've put it on the website so that you can go and have a look for yourselves in due course. We're also joined by Richard Blyth, who will be known to many of you as the Chief Policy Officer of the RTPI. They are joined by Satnam Choongh, Planning and Environmental Barrister at No5 Chambers, who likewise many of you will know and will have seen at many a residential appeal. Satnam helps navigate the way through and takes us to the key practical points arising from this rather tricky area. Without more, Satnam.
Well, the starting point for the government in all of this is the housing affordability crisis. House prices are several multiples of annual median incomes. The average, as I understand it, is 8 across the country, and in some areas it's considerably more than that. The government wants to use the planning system to tackle affordability, and the central assumption that underpins its planning policy response is that an increase in supply will make housing more affordable. So it's relying on one of the basic rules of economics, namely supply and demand. At the moment, the demand is greater than supply, so we increase the supply and house prices will come down. Under the existing standard method for calculating housing need, and even more so under the proposed standard method, the aim is to increase supply in the least affordable areas. The reasoning being that because these are the least affordable areas, these must be the areas where we must increase supply the most in order to get prices to come down. Now that leads to a question which I don't think has really been explored in any detail from an economic point of view, which is, well, what evidence is there that increasing the supply of new housing in any given area will reduce house prices to a material degree? In other words, bring prices down from multiples of 10 to median earnings down to multiples of 4, which seems to be the government's aim. So that's the economic question, and perhaps that's the place to bring Nico in.
Go for it, Nico. What? A simple question. There must be a very simple answer.
Well, okay, if you want a simple answer, then I should probably say yes, there is evidence. But the more complicated answer is it's not as simple as that. I think I completely agree when you say increasing supply will reduce prices. But that statement has an implicit assumption, and the implicit assumption is that demand stays constant. And the evidence that we have looks at increasing supply and keeping demand constant. And if that's the case, then yes, prices will come down. The problem is that we also have very good evidence that shows that increasing housing supply affects demand. There are certain services that are only profitable to provide above a certain threshold of density. So the more dense an area becomes, the more services it will receive. These are various services very often considered amenities to the area. So this can be provision of infrastructure, this can be retail provision, and similar types of amenities. And that means that if you start building more in a certain area, yes, you will increase supply, but you will also affect demand. And that means that the impact on prices is not that easy to predict, because you have to predict the movement of supply and the movement of demand at the same time. And the evidence that we have of actually focusing specifically on the most unaffordable areas, and affordability being measured by the price to income ratio, it looks like when you start building in those areas, then you affect supply, but you affect demand a lot more. And what tends to happen is that actually affordability decreases in those areas.
Well, that is such a clear explanation. And it instantly gets you thinking about particular areas, no doubt, wherever one is particularly engaged in and working in at the moment. And I know that Satnam and I were knocking the question around a little earlier and had certain areas of the country in mind. Satnam raised a particularly interesting example of somewhere like Kensington and Chelsea, which has a huge affordability problem of a particular kind, and really rather low opportunities for increasing supply. But I suspect that's not the type of site that you and area which you particularly have in mind. You're thinking about areas which do have capacity to increase supply. And it strikes me that, Nico, what you're saying is if one starts to get to critical levels of population, you're improving the place as a place to be and live, and it becomes more attractive.
Well, that's certainly true, but there's also a disamenity effect of density. So as a typical economist, I can again say it's more complicated than that. And the truth is we don't really understand the exact relationship. We understand the mechanism, but we can't really quantify the exact response. So on the one hand, when you increase density, there is a number of new services that are now profitable to provide in the area, and you increasing the provision of amenities. On the other hand, you're increasing congestion, and that's usually a disamenity. So there are all these forces at play that sometimes work against each other, and the net effect which we observe in prices is actually very difficult to predict. So we have some evidence that shows an exogenous shock to housing supply in the most unaffordable areas. And yes, Kensington and Chelsea is included in that research, but it's included as one of, I think, 300 areas in London. So it's hard for me to comment on a specific location. But the evidence shows that if you increase supply in the most unaffordable areas, affordability ratios actually become even more unfavorable. It's difficult to say if there is a point at which you provide enough new houses to break this cycle and to start lowering prices. This we don't know, and it's hard to comment on this.
Well, yes, Nico, that was one of the things that I found most fascinating about your article, that we're in a part of the job where there's a lot of talk about increasing housing supply and thereby increasing affordability. And your article actually demonstrates that in certain areas, by increasing housing, you actually increase demand. The place becomes more desirable to live, and that in itself leads to an increase in prices.
The case, we observe this not only in the response of house prices, but we also observe this in the response of incomes. So what tends to happen is that if you increase housing supply, incomes in the area increase. Now, we don't know whether these are incomes of people who always lived in the area or if this is just the effect of new people moving into the area, but we can definitely show you that the average income in the location is going up. So yes, there is definitely an effect of density on amenities, but there is also an economic effect of increasing incomes.
Well, that is really pulling together housing numbers, social effects in terms of amenity and disamenity, and economy. And you have brought together so much of what is planning and what is the subject of the reforms which are proposed and have now been commented on. And I wonder if at this point it would be convenient to bring in Richard Blyth and ask Richard to react to some of those points which have come out from Satnam and from Nico.
Of course, what the government proposes is not more home. Let's be very clear about that. It's more planning permissions. So if we dial back, first of all, other things being equal, as Nico has said, if there are more homes and the whole housing market is about the purchase of homes for sale, which by no means is, but supposing that everybody's an owner-occupier and a potential owner-occupier and you don't change anything else at all, including demand for housing, then it's true that over a 20-year period, if you increase the number of homes that are for sale, there would be some impact in the price. Let's remember at the moment we build something like 1% of housing stock each year. So all those economists that compare the planning system to loaves of bread are barking up entirely the wrong tree. This is much more like the stock of gold in the world and how it increases. So if you were to double housing supply from 1% to 2%, the impact on the price of housing, which is mainly governed by the price of second-hand home sales, would be eventual but very, very slow to come through, except in certain very limited locations where the supply is currently very small. Secondly, the relationship between granting planning permissions and supplying homes even for sale is quite a weak one. So at the moment, for example, the number of planning permissions has soared since 2010, but the number of housing completions has not increased by anything like as much. So these relationships are very weak. Secondly, as Nico has very ably pointed out, it assumes that nothing happens to housing demand. Now, housing demand over the last 40 years has been hugely fueled by a number of wider considerations. One, which is often quoted, is the lack of alternatives, the opportunity for people to rent social and private rented sector housing has been reduced, particularly reductions in social housing. So the pressure is therefore put on market sale housing. Secondly, the opportunity for people to save effectively for their retirement has been absolutely trashed. So, I mean, if you owned stocks and shares in, I think it was the 1st of January 2000, they'd be roughly worth the same today. So people with, an eye to their retirement, and there's quite a big boomer generation involved there, have been led to make other investments, which of course have then driven out first-time buyers who you could argue more legitimately should be buying the homes. Thirdly, housing is extraordinarily oddly treated by the tax system. If you sell your home, any profit that you make on it over and above the rate of inflation is tax-free, which is the most extraordinary attitude to take to an asset. Not surprising, money piles into it. We've had very, very low interest rates for some considerable time, particularly since 2009. And economists tell me that if you lower the interest rate, what happens is that the value of assets is driven up. And finally, housing is incredibly lightly taxed on a day-to-day basis. You were referring to central London. If you own a flat in Manhattan, you would pay something like $40,000 a year property tax on it. If you own a flat in central London, you're probably paying about £3,000 a year council tax. So we have a very strange system. And all of this adds to the sort of the weight behind the demand for housing, which is, as economists say, is acting on the other side of the supply point. In addition, there is an economic strategy for the country. The Prime Minister referred to levelling up. If you simply say that we will build houses where the current price of houses is highest, this will become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it doesn't actually deal with the need for economic revival in other parts of the country, where you could attach the production of housing for sale as part of a wider strategy for example, investing in offshore turbine production and maintenance on the East Coast, nuclear energy on the West Coast, strong health and bio investments in places like Manchester. But unless you have a joined up strategy, just simply building more houses around London is not going to help the other parts of the country. My final point is, actually, if the government really believed this, why didn't it just build some houses? Interest rates are incredibly low. The government could build houses for sale and then sell them to people at lower prices than they currently may have to pay on the open market. And boy, would that have an impact on the house price. So there's a lot wider questions than planning. And for the government to sort of load this onto the shoulders of the planning system, which does have a part to play, but certainly not the whole part, seems to me to be, likely to be a kind of overreach.
Well, there's certainly a huge amount there to get our teeth into, going way beyond the simple matter of supply and demand and affordability in the standard method.
Yeah, well, the problem is actually, we've kind of dealt with buy-to-let, because actually that is not subject to capital gains tax exemptions. But the difficulty is the owner-occupied sector. And there again, it seems very strange to me that regardless of the value of your home, you have the same tax exemption. So I would really like to see a map that showed how much the taxpayer is paying on capital gains tax exemption by local authority. And although everyone in the country pays tax, I wouldn't be at all surprised if you find that the principal private residence exemption is spending mainly in areas of high house prices. So this is a huge incentive to people to invest in their own home as well as second homes. And we no longer tax this. The economists like the fact that until 1963 we did tax people for owning their own home because they had housing services flowing from their own ownership. That has been abolished, and it's interesting that it was kind of in the 60s that some of this house price inflation started to begin to take flight.
I mean, there's a lot that we've covered in terms of sources of demand. What is it that's leading to the upward pressure on house prices? I think just sort of focusing in on housing numbers, is there any work out there in the economic sphere, Nico, which would tell us what sort of uplift in housing numbers one would need to make any kind of meaningful impact on house prices? So in other words, what percentage increase is needed compared with, say, existing housing stock in a given area? And now I appreciate that one of the points that you made in your article is that, of course, we assume these housing market areas are sealed almost, when of course in reality that's not the case. And also you make the point that increasing housing can itself lead to yet more demand. And I know it's difficult to leave those out of the equation, but is there anything out there which would tell us, if you want to have a meaningful impact on price, what sort of level of increase in housing stock would one actually require?
Well, if you add a small amount to supply and everything stays constant, then the response in prices is going to be small. Obviously, this depends on elasticities of supply and demand, but the general rule is that the more supply you add, the more effect it's going to have on prices. Now, some new supply is going to have more of an effect on prices than no new supply. That's definitely true. But then again, I think it's an interesting question of actually adding supply, or, as the white paper is arguing, taking away planning constraints. And I think we have excellent evidence on planning constraints being too strict in many parts of the country and limiting development and actually holding prices up.
Is the best example there Greenbelt?
I'm going to stay away from that because it's a policy question, and I'm not a policy person. I'm an economist. I don't know if that's the best example, but it's certainly one example.
Well, an interesting thing on Greenbelt is to compare places that have one with places that don't. So I always think it's rather strange that this emphasis on Greenbelt is mentioned. If you compare Nottingham and Leicester, Nottingham has a Greenbelt and Leicester doesn't. I'd be very surprised if you can see much in the way of difference in house prices between those two cities. So I'm not sure that Greenbelt really is a relevant point.
Well, on the question of Greenbelt, Nico, there was one aspect of your article that struck both Richard and I as quite remarkable, which is that you show that if there were to be a huge expansion of housing on the green belt around London, and when I say huge, we're talking, I think, 1.6 million new homes being built on the green belt around London, I think what you say in your article is that would really only have a very modest impact on house prices. So even a massive intervention in terms of policy, so doing away with large swathes of the green belt around London and constructing a very large number of housing in one go, even then it only has a fairly limited output in terms of dampening house prices.
Yes, so the conclusion of the research was not about prices themselves, but about affordability. And the impact that we find, or the impact that we project of a huge expansion of supply on affordability is actually very, very small. So yes, building a huge amount of housing would improve affordability, but it wouldn't improve affordability that much for the reasons I mentioned already. So I think the overall conclusion from the research is that if the estimates that we get from small incremental increases in supply hold also for large increases in supply, then that projection would mean very large increases in supply would actually not affect affordability that much because of the joint reaction of supply and demand.
So in the light of that evidence, where we take the example of large amounts of housing on the green belt around London, sort of a huge boost to housing supply, taking that example as our starting point, Nico, what's your response to what we see in the white paper, where the talk is about increasing the existing housing stock by 0.25%? I mean, some people are saying it shouldn't be 0.25%, should be 0.75%, and I appreciate that it's not simply 0.25 which is being put forward. It's 0.25 and then another increase to take account of affordability. But in the light of what your study is showing and what you're telling us, are these small increases going to make any difference at all? 0.25%, 0.75%, even 1% increase in housing stock? Is that going to have a meaningful impact on affordability? Does the evidence bear that out?
Yes. So the data that we have and the analysis we perform is based on existing historical data, and this is looking at sort of small incremental changes. And you're right, they make little difference. There is a concept in economics that we like to use called elasticity. And elasticity of price to changes in supply would be a 1% change in supply and then X% change in price. And this would give you an elasticity of price to changes in supply. And it may sound technical, but it gives you an idea of how much of a response in price you get for a shock to supply. And it's very unlikely that for a 1% increase in supply, we would get a massive reduction in prices. There will be a reduction in price, but it's not going to reduce affordability ratios from 20 to 4 or from 8 to 4.
Well, it is surprising that no one's done this work to actually look at what percentage increase leads to what percentage decrease in house prices.
Well, it is surprising, isn't it, Satnam? I completely agree with you.
I'm not at all surprised.
So Richard isn't surprised at all.
I think it's very clear why it hasn't been done.
Go on, Richard. Why is that?
Well, because there are very strong forces that want it to happen. And I continually asked over the 10 years I've been doing this job, will you show me what the impact of the changes you're proposing will be on house prices? And I've never had an answer. The last person to look at it very carefully was Kate Barker in 2004, and she came to the same conclusion, that there would be a small impact over a 10 to 15-year period of sustained and substantial increases in housing supply, but you'd have to keep it up a very long time, and then eventually you would see something feeding through. The difficulty for economists is that it only takes something like the global financial crisis or this virus or Brexit to suddenly throw a big rock into the pool and make it very difficult to observe the impact of one of the things you've changed. Why can't we have a discussion about all of the possible policy levers and which ones would have the greatest impact, with some allowance for the fact that you might have bundles of policy? So you could have tax changes, you could have a government program of building houses for sale, you could have, you could bundle up a number of things and then say, we propose to do all of these things, and we've estimated that this bundle of things would have this overall impact.
Well, Richard, is one of the problems, and please disagree with this if you think it's not right, is one of the problems that the bundles are in silos. So there is a planning silo which is seeking to address an identified social and economic problem and battle against the environmental constraints and trying to tackle it within its own silo. But what you identify is that in another silo, the tax silo, is a bundle or a part of a bundle which might actually have a very substantial effect in a relatively short time period. But getting policymakers to integrate as between these silos has so far not proven to be terribly feasible, or at least to have happened effectively. Am I off the mark?
Well, I think it's a bit more, I wouldn't say sinister, but it's a bit more directional or intentional than that. So we have a group of thinkers who've been around for a few decades, whose argument is that the planning system is a regulatory function of the state, a bit like we have environmental health, which is there to make sure that you don't eat rat droppings when you go to a restaurant, or we have building control, which is there to make sure that buildings stay up and don't burn down. And that view has been accepted among many people in politics and in academia almost, and certainly in policy sort of think tanks. And actually that isn't what planning is for. And therefore, once you put something into a box and say, this is the purpose of this government activity is to regulate the granting of planning permissions for housing for sale, then you've already created the silo. But it doesn't need to be in a silo. That's something which has been chosen as a way of thinking about it, rather than, say, something which arises through the accidental boundaries of government departments and people not talking to each other.
Now that is profound and immensely significant.
Well, it's extremely profound, isn't it? Because the starting point, to say that the role of the planning system is not regulatory is a very different way of looking at things from the way that it's normally looked at. The understanding normally is that planning is a regulatory regime. And of course, once you say it's a regulatory regime, it's very easy then to say, well, regulation equates to red tape. It's the red tape that's holding us back. And if we cut out the red tape, and then the problem can be resolved. So planning is a red tape. You get rid of the red tape, more housing comes forward, and indeed house prices then begin to go down. That's the theory. To say that the role of the planning system is not regulatory but something else will probably require a completely new podcast to discuss. But just moving the debate on slightly, another question that arises is what implications does this debate have for affordability in rural areas? So just going back to Nico's point about how increasing housing or increasing the supply of housing can actually lead to more demand and push house prices up. I do wonder what that means for rural areas, because we often hear the argument, with which a lot of people are very sympathetic, that there is real problems with affordability in rural areas. So the question that comes to my mind is, what would happen if we increased housing in rural areas? Would that actually help people, local people who struggle to access the housing market? Will an increase in supply actually assist them?
Yeah, so I think the question here is the problem that housing is too expensive, or is the problem that there aren't enough jobs in the area that would allow those people to purchase those houses? And I think this is a hard question, and it's possibly off topic a little bit. But you have to remember that, especially in rural areas, if you start increasing supply, then the effect of density is going to be much stronger than the marginal effect of density in cities. Because suddenly the larger the area gets, the more profitable it will be to provide services to the city, to the area. And if you start from a low base, the effect is potentially a lot stronger.
Could I come in here with a very topical observation, please?
We never turn away topical observations.
Well, I was talking to, about my job to, I wouldn't say a complete stranger, but I mean, a complete member of the public, a distinguished board member of a charity that I happen to have tea with. And he said to me, well, what about this virus? And I think this question of Devon and Cornwall is quite relevant here, because we are possibly seeing a situation in which the forces that drew people into working in big skyscraper offices in big cities are weakened. We don't know whether this is whether it be permanent, whether it will be, whether we'll claw back some of that. But one of the questions is, therefore, there's a lot of people who might fancy living in Devon and Cornwall permanently and undertaking their high-value work through the internet. Those people are quite likely to be very well resourced, and so we could see a substantial level of competition for housing assets in attractive places by people who currently don't live in them. My board chair was saying, how does that work then? And I said, well, that's a political question. It's a question of how we want to run the country. Therefore, it's a political question as to, are we going to have a lot of people doing this? Currently, you're allowed to, it's not China, you can live where you choose. But the impact on some of these host rural communities could be very substantial. It's already hard enough to buy a house if you're a low-wage earner in the southwest. This could be hugely exacerbated unless we actually grapple with this question and say, well, what as a country are we actually going to do about it?
Nico, this relationship between different areas and how increasing supply in one area can have an impact on prices in another area is something that you discuss in your article. And that's a very important factor, isn't it? Perhaps you could just expand on that for us.
Absolutely. Economists, especially urban economists, tend to think of cities as systems of locations. And those locations are interlinked in many different ways, including by what we call a spatial arbitrage. So if prices go up in one area, then logic dictates that people should move to another area that is nearby. And this sort of process of choosing the optimal location within a city is what we refer to as spatial arbitrage. And this spatial arbitrage means that all housing markets are connected, and they're connected by people choosing between going and living in Cornwall and working remotely, or whether they choose to live in London and commute every morning on a packed tube. And the idea is that choice dictates the housing prices, and that the current level of housing prices in both areas reflects the difference between the benefit that people receive from moving from one area to the other area. So that the marginal person that is comparing Cornwall and London would be indifferent between either of those locations, because the difference in prices is compensating that person for all the benefits and all the costs of living in one location over the other.
My concern about this way of looking at the world is it assumes that everybody is in the same position to exercise those choices. And actually, I remember reading in one economics textbook that it said firms and households are engaged in a relentless search for the best location, which has become a bit of a joke at the office, that you rush home and just check, am I in the best location, or am I going to move my spouse and my children in school to find the optimum location? And actually, how people make these decisions is very complicated. It relates to all sorts of other issues around their social ties, but also some people are hugely disadvantaged in being able to exercise those kind of choices. So it concerns me if a model is built assuming that effectively everyone has the same income and can therefore all exercise the same level of optimization.
Well, hopefully I can put you at ease and promise you that this is not an assumption that is being made anymore. So this is a traditional assumption that used to be made by economists maybe 20, 30 years ago. At the moment, we are focusing on the marginal person that is actually trying to actively choose between locations. So it's not that everybody is trying to compare every single location, is that we're looking at the choices of a marginal person who's actually considering Cornwall and London, and they're trying to decide whether to go to one or the other. And we're also looking at a number of different frictions and a number of things that can affect the decision that are interlinked. So I'm not making a claim that we are perfect in reflecting everything, but yes, I completely agree with you that the sort of simplified model that we used to use 30, 40 years ago was too simple, and we are now trying to make it more realistic. But the basic results seem to hold.
Well, that's certainly reassuring.
I mean, that discussion raises the question, can we regenerate areas simply by directing more housing to those areas? Or do we need to direct development as a package? So more economic activity coupled with more and relatively more affordable housing. Because your analysis, Nico, if you take London as an example, shows that by directing housing to a location, you increase its amenity, its desirability, and by increasing its desirability, you pull in more people and you increase incomes overall. It leads to economic development, economic regeneration, and greater, more wealthier areas. So that's one of the questions that we should perhaps be asking ourselves, which is to what extent can housing be the medium through which we regenerate areas and create new economic hubs?
Well, we have tried it once. Milton Keynes is a new city that was begun in 1970 on a field, pretty much. And it has one of the most successful economies of anywhere in the UK, and actually some very reasonable house prices. And if you talk to people who live in Milton Keynes, they'll also say that the great appeal of it is all the other stuff. So yes, they moved there because it was affordable to buy, but it has a very good level of local jobs of all kinds. And also, because it's been planned as a city, it has a huge amount of open space, which must be this year a particular benefit. So we have done it and it does work.
Well, that's fascinating, isn't it? What you're saying is because it's planned, and that is planned as to housing, as to economic opportunity, and as to amenity. And when one brings those things together on the one occasion that we've tried it, it's met with a degree of success.
It's the most recent and largest scale opportunity. And to correct, there's sometimes been a bit of a misapprehension about new towns. The first ones were, socialist in the sense that there was a heavy predominance of housing built and owned by the Development Corporation. But Milton Keynes was mainly built in a much more free market kind of environment. So a lot of the housing in Milton Keynes has been built by private house builders. But the key issue is that the process was led by a Development Corporation and not open to sort of random pieces of acquisition of farmland and sporadic development, but it took place according to a master plan.
And Richard, do you think that a similar approach now in the present time could have utility for the levelling up agenda, doing something about the northern cities and areas of deprivation? What can we do in terms of using the planning system and the delivery of housing in particular to turn around those areas? Are there lessons that we can learn from the past and apply?
The situation in areas of economic revival is slightly different because, as far as I can see, the key housing requirement in many deprived places is for a lot more social housing and also for a lot more of the improvement in the quality of the private housing stock, which is in some cases appallingly low. But one thing we put in our white paper response is actually that the sheer process of building homes creates jobs. So, you almost do it and build it and they will come to a certain extent. So I think that could be a component in a strategy, but it would need to be connected to other components, like, for example, getting behind offshore wind as an industry. And this government is, seems to be quite amenable to the idea that it will choose sectors to develop and build on, perhaps more than we've seen for some time. And housing could actually form a very useful component in a broad local economic strategy.
Well, that's really fascinating, and I'm grateful to Satnam for turning us to the question of levelling up, because in the housing numbers debate there has been a substantial question as between numbers north and numbers south, and it seems as if this really is a point at which it becomes still more complex, but perhaps even more important. So if one is rather more specific about north of England, if one, for example, thinks of northeast Manchester, that is an area to which your observation as to quality of housing stock in certain areas would properly apply. And what you've got then is a question as to not just housing numbers, but essentially replacing housing stock and improving the quality of both amenity and of the housing stock and of the economy. And that's why it becomes so much more complex. And that really is the business of planning, isn't it? And that is so much more complex than starting off with a field in Milton Keynes.
That reminds me of a related point that we touched upon earlier. You'll recall that Richard brought up the example of Kensington and Chelsea. And one of the questions, and this is really a question for Richard Blyth, about what the response of the planning system should be. So, for example, we know that Kensington Chelsea is one of the least affordable places in the UK. But one has to ask the question, well, what useful policy objectives would be served by increasing supply in this area? And should the question not really be, rather than asking what are the least affordable places and putting the housing there, should the starting point not be to identify the most sustainable places? And is it a safe assumption that the least affordable places are the most sustainable places? But also he raises the converse as well. Is it necessarily the right policy approach in all cases to deliver more housing to the most sustainable places? So, for example, we know that London is very sustainable, but is it necessarily a good idea in planning policy terms to be directing more housing there? And both of those questions lead me to start asking myself the question whether there is any utility in a standard approach, whether you use sustainability or affordability as the driver.
Well, I think we've got into a sort of hole ourselves, because it never used to be like this, in the 50s and 60s and 70s when we did this very well. But we seem to have come to a view that there is a single housing market in England and that therefore it needs to have 300,000 additional homes in it per year, which is quite an odd conclusion, because actually there are a whole series of overlapping different housing markets. Even Greater London is actually quite complicated to understand as a housing market. And so the difficulties you get with this idea that there's the 300,000 and then some person with a spreadsheet in Whitehall kind of like allocates them all to different local authorities is a very odd way of going about it. And in fact, I'm really with those who say it's not simply enough to say, well, we won't build in Berkshire, we will build in Teesside, and sort of expect the people to move to where there's room. That's not how housing markets work. And so the idea that you can have this 300,000 and somehow apportion it is nonsense. It's certainly true that within a housing market area of, say, possibly somewhere like the Thames Valley or bits of London's quite hard to analyse, but say somewhere simpler like, say, the Bristol area, then you can say, yes, this is kind of like for like. So if we provide houses on one side of Bristol, they're kind of the same as on the other side. So at that level, you can actually start thinking about housing markets. And this is how we used to do it in the 60s and 70s. We had proper plans for regions which worked out how many houses do we need in this region, how many new jobs do we need. We had regional economic councils And okay, it was a different world, but actually some of that thinking is still relevant today, especially if you've got a government that is interested in seeing what the state can do to regenerate the economy completely.
So what you're saying, Richard, is that not at a national level, that the standard approach is not something that necessarily works at a national level where it can be apportioned nationally, but certainly a return to regions and regional planning where you look at both sustainability and affordability at a regional level. Off the back of that, you direct housing where you think it's going to have the most utility in planning policy terms.
Well, the very new towns were done as part of those regional economic plans. So Telford was part of the West Midlands conurbation de-densification process. Milton Keynes was part of the South East plan. So they weren't conceived of in a national context. They were conceived of as part of a specific project to reduce overcrowding in Victorian city centres and provide people with a better life. And that is partly why the programme became a little bit discredited, particularly in, say, Merseyside, where it appeared that the people were being decanted out of the inner city and plonked in the countryside, and actually the problems with, say, Liverpool weren't really a shortage of housing in that sense. They were much more to do with a shortage of good quality housing. But the secret was to think of the thing in terms of a much more local, regional kind of strategy, rather than saying we've arrived at this 300,000 figure arbitrarily and now we need a computer to kind of carve that out and dump bits of it in different places, because I can't see what economic or social purpose that kind of computer process would actually serve.
So can I ask to anybody who would like to contribute the answer, if one were to be revisiting the white paper and inserting material and ideas to address that which you've just identified and articulated, what would we be saying? Would we be saying we need proper plans for regions or something else?
Well, what we have said as the RTPI is promoting a concept of green growth boards. So these would be a little like the way that Greater Manchester is now operating, is that you would establish strategies for different, if you like, topics or disciplines within an area, like, say, the environment, the skills and economic strategy, the health, the public health strategy, the health care strategy, so the NHS facility strategy. And you would have these strategies for the wider area, but the board would contain, if you like, the directors of each one of those functions, plus a portfolio holder, a member, an elected member from the consortium of local authorities to give it a political steer. And those boards would seek to align the different strategies. So there will be a broader housing strategy whose purpose was to help achieve public health outcomes and also economic outcomes and housing outcomes.
That's been put to the government in the consultation. We'll have to see whether anybody is reading and listening.
Just so almost a technical point that actually, true sustainability would include housing affordability. It's a triple bottom line. So we want to make decisions that result in the best environmental, economic and social outcomes all together, not necessarily picking any one of those three strands and giving overemphasis.
If I may, I think economists have looked at the question of, is it a good idea to build more housing in London? And the answer seems to be a resounding yes. The objective function for those researchers was economic welfare. And the concept of how you measure economic welfare is obviously a technical point, but if you agree that this is something that you want to maximize, the research that we have seen so far seems to suggest that planning regulations in London are too strict, there is not enough housing, and relaxing planning regulations and building more housing would actually increase welfare, not only of people who are already in London, but also of the people who would be able to move in. I have to say that I think economics as a profession has a bad reputation for ignoring social and environmental concerns. I don't think that reputation is deserved at the moment. It certainly was 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. But at the moment, some of the most important questions in economics are environmental sustainability and the social impact of economic policies. So this is something that we are looking at very closely, and it's a huge concern to us, and we try to incorporate that into our research as well. So when I say that we focus on welfare, our measures of welfare increasingly include environmental sustainability and as many social factors as we conceivably can consider. Obviously, it's very difficult to consider them all because it's obviously difficult to even define all aspects of human welfare, but we consider as many as we can. So I think when I say from the welfare point of view, we should be building more houses in London, our calculations seem to suggest that this is including not just the economic side, but also the environmental and the social side, all rolled into the same model.
It is fascinating. Well, that's been on all sides and in all silos, a fascinating discussion for which, for my part, I'm extremely grateful. I think that we'll draw it to a close there because I think that we have really covered the material which is set out to cover and quite a lot more. So I'm going to thank Nico. Nico, you've done a fantastic job in introducing us to something which is, having read your paper, I see just how fine-tuned and technical the material is that gets to the answers, but you've explained it in a way which is accessible to absolutely everybody. So thank you ever so much for that. It's really brilliant.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, and likewise to Richard Blyth for taking us not only up and down the country, but also throughout several decades of planning and introducing us to ideas which were successful some little time ago in the 1970s and earlier. And for taking us also into the sphere of taxation policy and its impact on this particular issue, and which might in fact be a greater impact than planning. So Richard, thank you very much to you also.
It's a pleasure. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
No, it has been a real pleasure, hasn't it? It's been really, really, really good fun to do. And Satnam, thank you. You have brought it all together brilliantly. Thank you ever so much indeed. That was the Planning Podcast from No5 Chambers. We trust that that was useful to you, that it was practical and took you to places which you'd not thought to go previously. That's the objective. If you have ideas for places that you'd like to go next, let us know. In the meantime, stay safe, stay well, and goodbye.